A major project of the American empire has been to de-Europeanize Europe over the last 50 years.
Has it? I mean,
yes, it
I don't
has.
like McDonald's either, man, but like, I don't like McDonald's either. I don't.
First of all, the Americans absolutely saw Americanization of European culture as part of the security mission. If you go into the embassies of like that they had in Afghanistan, Iraq, you can see like George Floyd murals and all this stuff.
They got rid of that. The Taliban painted over that mural.
Yeah, sure, but this is you can talk to people who worked in Afghanistan, Iraq, and they'll tell you the same thing. Like enormous gobs of money were spent explicitly trying to export American culture to these countries. And the same thing was underway in Europe as well.
Modernity, no. I mean, like
but part of it's modernity.
Yeah,
but part of it's also an explicit project of the American government. The second thing too is that the American supported governments in Europe currently are demographically de-Europeanizing Europe. In very short order, large swaths of Europe will no longer be part of a European civilization in the way that you just meant it. So, I mean, to do this whole thing where it's just like, well, you know, they're Europeans, therefore they're just like Americans. Hey, I'm not so sure Europeans should just be like Americans.
I'm a European American. I agree with you, man. I do. But like we basically have the same civilizational structures. There's some weird things that Europeans do, some regional quirks, and the Americans have their own thing. But basically, it's the same civilization.
Yeah, but the elites are not acting. But the elites are not preserving that, I think, is Dave's point.
100%. That's 100% true, man. That's 100% true.
Well, I mean, the question is here. Look, if you're a European country and you're talking about following the path of America,
right?
Part of the expectation should be demographic replacement migration. That is the American model, that we are going to replace your native population with elements of the third world and then remove the European aspect from your civilization as part of becoming modern. That has been the pattern in all European countries that have been under the American security umbrella.
Yeah, but those were decisions taken by their own local elites. Like, it wasn't General Eisenhower.
Their local elites only exist in those countries because America approves of them. If America disapproved of those elites, they would not be there.
Like the French made a decision, rightly or wrongly, on their own, in order to import a lot of workers in the 30 glorious years, 45 to 75, from their colonies to build stuff.
I flatly disagree with you. That was not an organic. This mass replacement migration into Europe was not an organic decision that emerged from the populations of Western Europe. You can pull these populations again and again and again.
Sure, I mean,
and you feel like you want to have mass replacement migration that will make you not your native demographic in 30 years. They'll be like, no, these opinions have been consistent for 70 years since Enoch Powell, and they keep on happening. It comes from their elites, and the only reason the elites are there is because the American government approves of them. That was the process after World War II. I agree with the first
and second thing you said, but not the third, man. Like, just obviously, I agree that populations are they should replace themselves, and too much change inorganically too quickly destroys culture, and we all know that. And there's like a synthesis between cosmopolitanism and nationalism.
I'll give you an example of that
stuff. But
I'll give you an example of this. I'll give you an example of how I see this happening.
Right.
Okay, so America, I don't think this is exactly true, because there was a previous concept of America where America was sort of the Anglo stock that colonized this country initially. That was the founders' understanding of America. But since the early 20th century, late 19th century, America was indeed a nation of immigrants to an extent. I am not Anglo stock. I am Eastern European / Irish stock, a little bit German. So American elites started saying, we're a nation of immigrants. We're a nation of immigrants. We need to integrate. We need to have diversity. So they had these phrases that you would never hear before in human history. We're a nation of immigrants. Diversity is our strength. We need to integrate. You never hear these phrases before the 20th century, and they only make sense in America, those three phrases. They only make sense in the American context. You go to Europe in the 80s, and obviously none of the people say those, but guess who does say them? All of their elites. The elites in Europe had Black Lives Matter protests in jurisdictions that had barely any Black people. And for a context,
I saw. Okay,
this indicates it's obvious where the European elites are getting this idea that they need to have mass migration, and they're getting it directly from America and American elites, to the point where they're literally repeating the own propaganda slogans that only make sense in the United States and only make sense in the United States context.
Look,
so mass immigration.
Again, we didn't hoist those. It's not like there's a project at the elite American level to hoist those kinds of ideas on European elites. These things happened for reasons that they happened or should not have happened, but it's not like
I'm not entirely convinced of that. I'm not entirely convinced that. I'm not entirely. I mean,
Dave, can you bring us through it? Can you bring us through the process, like starting from we have these American elites, and how do these American elites influence the European elites? Like, let's break it down.
So I mean, these ideas emerge in the university. You know, they gain salience in America, and then the State Department general project is to make sure that the ideas that are popular in America are popular in Europe, so that there is an international ideological cohesion. They absolutely consider this their mission. Now, I don't think there's like a smoke-filled room where they're like, oh, yeah, we're going to replace, Europe with Somalians or whatever. But they see it as the fact that the more Europe is like America, the more cohesive it will be with America's plans to exert its sphere of influence across the world. And so first of all, the universities themselves, since they're all part of one common publication system, naturally the ideas flow to their universities. And then the State Department at a governmental level encourages people that have American-style ideas and decides to work with them over people who have more organic ideas, like Enoch Powell. Enoch Powell's ideas were not radical. Enoch Powell's ideas were more or less the ideology that ruled Europe or ruled England for the previous 200 years. Yeah. The opinion of the State Department was that people like Enoch Powell were not cooperative. Why wouldn't you defend Enoch Powell?
I mean, he has a right to I'm not a racialist. Enoch Powell was a racist.
Enoch Powell. Why was he? Well, I don't know what racist even means.
Right.
Why is he condemnable in your? Why is what Enoch Powell? This is actually a good segue, right? Why is what Enoch? Because you're exhibiting the very attitude that imposes the American attitude towards immigration onto Europe, where it's radically inappropriate. I don't think there should be mass immigration in any country. I'm going to get that off the table right now. Not in America either.
Fine.
I think it's bad policy.
I'm against.
But explain to me why Enoch Powell is a condemnable figure.
Okay, well, so when you say rivers of blood, which is what he said,
it was a quote, and it also an accurate one. The amount of violence increase in England has been astronomical.
Sure.
They had like 4 stabbings in the last week. I mean, okay, when you're murdering children at a Taylor Swift concert, when you have stabbing after stabbing, is that not rivers of blood?
No, I think Vlad would agree with me that cultural...
Maybe by an Eastern European standard.
Well, no. I think
I'll say that.
I think Vlad would agree with us here.
By the expectations of Western Europe, which is much less violent than Eastern Europe, the amount of increase of crime in the UK, it's like by 400%.
No, Dave, I want to make sure you don't turn.
It's enormous.
I want to make sure you don't turn Vlad into a straw man over here for the people who think certain things of that nature.
Okay,
because if we're talking about cultural incompatibility, I think it's very clear to anybody with half a brain that the people who come from these places like Afghanistan, that 90% of them, there's going to be a lot of problems as far as they just don't belong culturally speaking, as far as what they practice, as far as the lessons that their parents pass on to their children. Absolutely.
Sure.
So I think
assimilating those kinds of immigrants takes 4 generations or 5 as opposed to 1. Like Lev and I came to America 30 years ago and we're like perfectly well assimilated.
No, but even I would go a step
further. You're using the American example. This does not work in other countries. First of all, it doesn't quite work that way in America. There are huge, broad, unassimilated. First of all, I don't necessarily want cultural assimilation. In many ways, that's cultural homogenization.
Right.
But even so, like there are immigrant populations in the Philippines from China that have not assimilated for like 1,000 years almost.
Right.
There are immigrant populations in Africa that have not assimilated in 500 years. This idea that like you wait 6 generations and magically you assimilate, this is exactly what I am concerned about. This is where we're importing a very specific phenomenon that happened in a very specific time in America and assuming that it's some kind of law of nature.
And I want to go a step further. I would go a step further. I would say that if you are any Western country, you have to make sure that whoever it is that's going to be going into your country, it's not going to be this gambling thing. Well, maybe they'll assimilate, maybe they won't. There have to be things known in advance that 100% this person who's going to be a citizen of our country is already going to be at the level, however we define that level. That's my personal position. Okay. I think that's a pretty fair one, and that's a far cry from what's going on in Europe right now. I think you would agree with me there, Dave.
I will say that if you took a moderate from Enoch Powell's time, the person fence sitter in Enoch Powell's time, they heard the infamous Rivers of Blood speech, which again, Enoch Powell was quoting someone else saying Rivers of Blood, and he was accurate. But if you took them and you brought them from, 1970 to 2024 and showed them what's happening under the Keir Starmer regime, they'd be like, Enoch Powell was absolutely right. Everything he said was vindicated. This is just him accurately describing the future. That's what anybody from 1970s England would say if they could see 2024 right now.
Population shifts and population, you and I agree, population demographic shifts, which are too big and too fast, and with the wrong kind of people, with the wrong kinds of culture in too large numbers are extraordinarily disruptive to a population.
Which is exactly what Enoch Powell was saying in his speech.
Right, except like the racialism is very difficult for like a liberal. I mean, it's difficult for like American cosmopolitan liberal national like me to.
Race is just a reality. It is a reality. If you move populations that are of different races into the same area, there's an increase.
Culture is what I'm talking about.
Well, race is kind of
culture is correlated with race, and
I don't agree, man. I'm like.
I mean, we could say, for example, that race, in terms of the differentiations, is culture times like thousands and thousands of years. People repeating certain patterns over and over again, and then starting to diverge in different ways. But more to the point about the universities, what I want to get back to that. If we're talking about, let's say, the Sorbonne in Paris, attended, by Pol Pot and all of these leftist intellectuals, that wasn't American. That was like a leftism that was going on in Europe at the time. So I see what you're saying, Dave, but I think that this is more of an international type of deal that, let's say,
globalization went too far, but like the technology was there and planes were there, and it's very difficult to stem that kind of technological tide in a post-war situation.
Japan did it.
Yeah, they did it. Yeah,
this was a decision the government made.
Sure.
England decided to demographically transform itself. People like Enoch Powell warned them. Enoch Powell was right, and now they're suffering the consequences. And as a result, they're going to have a hard-handed government just to stop the country from dissolving into further chaos and violence.
But is it so much America's fault as opposed to this more international, stateless order, if you will, that's composed of universities and people who inhabit them? Because that I see as making a lot more sense than just saying
whatever you want to call it, internationalism.
Yeah,
Dave, we can call it something different, but I don't think Americans are imposing that kind of thing. It's
American. What Americans are doing is they're feeding it money. This globalist elite that we complain about in the universities is almost entirely being funded by United States taxpayer dollars.
Yeah, because America is the winner.
They're being funded by paying the universities.
Because America was the winner.
The State Department.
That's the problem, Dave. Like, I agree with you, but America happened to be the winner on the world stage. It was the fattest calf. So, of course, that was the one that a lot of these leftists, sank their teeth into and grew in this parasitic fashion. So my only point here is that you are right that a lot of these universities and think tanks originate in America, but it's not like they're American. It's that they're using the bountifulness of America and making that something that allows them to go into these other countries and make a lot of problems.
Liberalism and nationalism of a kind you're defending are not incompatible, man. Like, they're not incompatible. Like, in fact, they should be compatible.
Well, I mean, if they should be compatible, they don't appear to be compatible in the 21st century. That's the problem right now, is that if you have just a huge demographic First of all, liberalism only works in high trust societies, or only works well in high trust societies. And we have not been able, I don't think we've ever seen historically a high trust society that's been multicultural without the caveat here, without the existence of some kind of Lee Kuan Yew character
Singapore.
to keep everything under wraps, like Singapore.
No, an ideology. Communism did it. The Austro-Hungarian Empire did it for a while. It didn't last more than a century.
Yeah, absolutely. Austro-Hungarian. That's my favorite example, right? Like,